Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. I'm with David Frank. My name is Eric Kirk. We are discussing national political news of the day, and there's a lot of stuff going on. Again, the Middle East is at the top of the political minds across the nation, including the students. Even as they're getting ready, many of them are getting ready to graduate. There probably aren't going to be a whole lot of ceremonies in a lot of the colleges across the country. But we've had remarks from politicians. We have judges, federal judges, who I believe are acting unethically, saying conservative judges saying that they are not going to hire Columbia University students as interns and clerks. You've got Joe Biden saying that these demonstrations may be overstating that there's been anti-Semitism. There have been anti-Semitic incidents, but they have not been overwhelmingly anti-Semitic. A point made by our own Jewish community leaders more recently, towards the end of the week, last week, in response to our own university leadership and some of our elected leadership who are maybe a little bit overzealous in claiming that our local demonstrations were anti-Semitic. I actually encourage people to seek out the statement that was made by the university and the local elected officials and the response, which can be found on Redheaded Black Belt. The response again by our local rabbis and Jewish leaders. We have this. Meanwhile, protests are going on. Arrests are being made. Students are being suspended. Some of the classes are being violent, where there are counter demonstrators are being violent. Some schools are actually working out peaceful compromises and Sacramento State, for instance, followed Brown University and Northwestern University's examples and worked out some type of deals. And so, at least to discuss the possibility of divestment, which is these pushes. But we have a lot of demonstrations that apparently to some people resemble the demonstrations that took place in 1968, which are said to have been factors in which contributed to the defeat of the victory of Nixon over then Humphrey, Democratic candidate Humphrey, and Bernie Sanders has suggested that maybe these demonstrations and Gaza could end up being Biden's Vietnam. Now, he has clarified that he will fight to help Biden win despite his disagreements with Biden with regard to the military support for Israel, despite the fact that even President Biden has expressed his opposition to Israel's aggression in Gaza, which has resulted in reports of as many as 34,000 dead, some estimates higher, in Gaza, including thousands of children. And even as ceasefire talks are happening, they have already begun some initiatives into Rafah, which was supposed to be the last place that Gazan Palestinians could go that was safe, where they could actually have food, water, and medical care. And so they're being told to leave that right now. And President Biden has finally taken an actual material step and has withheld a large shipment of offensive ammunition. This has led to kind of a freakout among pro-Israeli lobby and supporters. But Biden has not really had any kind of strong rhetoric. He's just said that enough is enough, and that he will not support Netanyahu's aggression into Rafah. to some people in the progressive world and the anti-war movement. Maybe it's too little, too late, but it does seem to have had some kind of effect. There do seem to be it is being reported some progress in the ceasefire talks between Hamas and the Israeli government. We'll see what comes of it. But that's where we're at. There's a lot to talk about. But Dave, I'm going to let you kind of fill in what I left out, and let's see where we go with this conversation because there's a lot to discuss.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks as always for such a good setup here of this, the what's at stake and kind of what some of the parameters are here. I think the way that we talked about framing this is, based on Bernie Sanders' comment, and I think it was even as recently as yesterday, where he said, unfortunately, it could be that Vietnam moment for President Biden, and so what I know you you mentioned it a little bit that back in 1968 that there was a huge split in within the Democratic Party, and it was about kind of the handling of the war. And Vice President Humphrey was seen as not being responsive to the values of young people who were trying to express their principles through the political civil disobedience. And a lot of those young people did get voice through Robert Kennedy. And so that split was tangible in terms of like the embodiment of actual political leadership. I think what's a little bit different now. Oh, and let me just say this. Richard Nixon did go on to win with just 45% of the vote that year, in part because there was a lack of enthusiastic support for the Democratic candidate, which most famously, if people remember or not, but Chicago, the Democratic convention at Chicago, in Chicago, what is historic in many ways, police brutality, among other things, but it's people are kind of seeing some parallel. People are seeing real parallels to that level of energy and expectation that with the Democratic convention being in Chicago again this summer, really soon actually, that in fact there's going to be massive protests there, and that it could be another opportunity for activists to have their voices heard, or at least break through the apathy, the perceived apathy of both the leadership and maybe fellow electorate, fellow citizens. So I think that Bernie Sanders, in saying that, there's a lot to consider. But there's ways we can go with this. What about politically? What about values? But I think let's just talk leadership. And so President Biden, I think, finds himself in the unenviable position that if his advisors, foreign policy advisors, are most likely telling him, look, Israel's our staunchest ally and there's no parallel here. Don't worry, like we have to take care of our ally without any unconditionally. As you mentioned, there has been a change to that finally, but up until this point, we didn't really see much of that. What we didn't see was a lot of behind the scenes diplomacy, of course,
Sure.
but publicly anyway, we didn't see leadership. We didn't see, and in fact, we saw the opposite of leadership in many ways. We saw the this is a very controversial way to frame it, but a kind of the disparagement of people who are representing their values, criticizing potential war crimes and other asymmetric or disproportionate realities in the Israeli leadership, and among other things. I mean, we can go down that path, but I would like to stay more on the idea of, well, what about our American leaders? And the truth is that this could still very well end up going in that direction. But the idea, I think, is that it's not history. What they say, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. I'm fairly confident that people realize that this is a time for us to not implode as a country, and instead to give some space for students to express their values, hopefully have public discourse and learn more about what these people are actually representing, what is and what isn't happening in these protests.
Yeah, I mean, if this does, we've been talking about how he's been doing things behind the scenes, and in fact, Brooks and Capehart actually complimented him on not politicizing what he has been successful on, which basically was, for instance, a few weeks ago, after Iran threw a whole bunch of missiles at Israel. They weren't very successful in generating harm or anything, but it was a very aggressive act in response after Israel attacked the Iranian embassy in Syria. And apparently, behind the scenes, Blinken, on behalf of Biden, was very successful in convincing Israel to do a token, very measured response at Iran, letting them know that they could do a lot more damage, a non-lethal bombing somewhere in central Iran near some facility, and without taking credit for it publicly and the rest. And Kate Martin Brooks, who are the PBS NewsHour commentators, one Democrat, one Republican, both praised him for this. But, he's running for president. If he doesn't find a way to take credit for it, even though he's not Donald Trump, who's going to say that was the best measure ever, whatever, he needs to find a way to sell it to the public. If by having done this, held this this ammunition, and continues to do so in the future until we get a ceasefire, and this does in fact end this war, at least this particular battle in the long-term war, that could be a selling point in the election for him. It could be something, because right now his polling is his approval rating is at the lowest of anybody in like 70 years. I think Truman in 1948 only had lower ratings. He's the only one. Caveat there: Truman did win that election. And there's a question as to whether or not the low ratings really mean anything. But at this point, however, so the point is that they're low because you've got the Republicans that don't like him, you've got Democrats that are cranky, and then you've got now the youth vote that are going to say they don't like him. But and the biggest thing about them is not worrying that they're going to vote for Trump. It's just whether they'll turn out at all, as you noted, what happened in 1968. Well, they probably will turn out, at least as numbers of them, because we also have the abortion issue, and they'll be thinking more about the abortion issue if the Middle East crisis has passed by that time. So if he can end this over the next few weeks without too many more children in Gaza being killed, and I hate to put it that way, he could be through over that hurdle. And I hate to put it in this kind of calculus, but he might do well for himself. But he's got to really twist Netanyahu's arm, and maybe he's found the way to do it. We won't know. We don't know yet. Netanyahu is being dismissive of this, but he's got his own problems. He was actually trying to not invade Rafah, but according to people for Haaretz, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's a lefty magazine in Israel, his arms being twisted by the right-wingers, the hardliners in his own coalition, are threatening to pull out if he doesn't invade Rafah. And if that happens, his coalition falls apart. There's a no confidence vote. He's out of power. He gets prosecuted and goes to jail. I mean, there's a lot of dynamics going on here, and it's a tough situation. But this could be make or break for Biden.
Yeah, I think it's I like that you pivoted to the political side of it right now, because the other things, they're more substantive, more academic, more values based, and really more suitable for a different forum than what we've got. We're kind of doing the quick hits here, and politically speaking, I saw some recent granular polling, and young people, generally speaking, are animated by the opportunity to express their values, to kind of stand up for the underdog, and potentially be critical of Israel's policies, while older people are more animated by their recollection of foreign policy from over the decades, over their lifespan. And so that kind of plays out to, generally speaking, stronger support for the Palestinian cause for young people, and much more, almost 2 out of 3, senior voters, of people over, like, say, I think 50 and up say that they would rather vote for somebody who's strongly defending Israel and Israel's security. So that's a very divisive issue. And then when you factor in to the reality that older people tend to vote much more frequently or more predictably, reliably than younger people, I think that White House has a calculation that they need to track a little bit closer to the people that they think are going to vote, particularly given Biden's age. I think he's like almost 80, and Israel's only like less than that, right? So he's been around a long time. And so I'll just end this by saying that the political calculation, unfortunately, is for Biden to track to the right as long as he can, knowing he's got to come back towards the base to keep them in the loop.
Yeah, I think he's got to end. He's got to end the war, and that's a bit tall order because it's not his war, right? This isn't America. I mean, we're sending weapons, but even I need to point out he's withholding weapons, but Israel doesn't need the weapons to invade Rafah. Israel can go on with this war probably for a year without more weapons from the United States. They make their own ammunition. They get it from other countries. They get shipments from India, from other places as well. It's more symbolic than real, but still the symbolism is powerful. It's enough that again, pro-Israel politicians are flipping out over it. The fact that Biden is doing this, but it may be having an effect. He needs to put an end to this war, and we can talk about morally. I think he needed to put an end to it months ago, but politically, he needs to put an end to it now.
I want to watch this witch hunt myself. I've been going through a witch hunt for years. This is really now getting dirty.
My message is simple. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how much money you think you may have, no one is above the law.
What we have here is an attempt to hurt me in an election.
Next topic. Actually, it's multiple topics. Trump in court. I mean, it just goes on. It's a circus. But I have to say, the judge kept it from turning into an absolute circus. Stormy Daniels was in court the other day, and of course, she testified to what we all expected her to testify to. It got a little bit, I won't say out of hand, but in a lot of detail that maybe wasn't quite necessary. We've all heard the stories about her spanking him with the newspaper and, all the different details and her describing his parts and all that kind of stuff. And it was essential to a certain degree, but and I'll explain why in a minute. But that wasn't the only part of the trial. Hope Hicks was in there too, his former assistant in the White House, and she cried and did the whole thing. But she was essential to the testimony as well. And the prosecution is again putting together the case of the trail of the hush money. Stormy Daniels was there primarily to describe what the hush money was for, and she had to describe what she did in order for the jury to understand exactly what they were covering up. I mean, but she maybe took it a little too far. The prosecution maybe took it a little too far, and Trump was actually mouthing with his words obscenities. Judge told him to knock it off. He had already been held in contempt one more time, received one more $1,000 fine, as we discussed last week. That's the maximum fine you can have for a single act of contempt. He's been warned, no more fines. Next time you do it, you're going to jail. So we'll see what happens there, because that's going to be a big moment. And Trump has said, I'm not afraid of going to jail. There's going to be a lot of fundraising over that. If it happens, will there be violence? I don't know. I actually, the protests in his favor have been kind of underwhelming so far, but we'll see. That's a big step. So Stormy Daniels went in, gave physical details about it. Everybody's saying, well, this is salacious. Trump's attorneys made a motion for a mistrial, saying it's prejudiced the jury. From what the reporters in the courtroom have described, the jury was actually getting kind of bored with it. First of all, everybody's read about this, and they were they were actually kind of rolling their eyes. And the judge said, "You are getting into too many details here. Dial it back." And apparently, Stormy Daniels did dial it back and kept it to the facts. But she had to get into those details because publicly Trump has accused her of lying about it. So she got into details that could be corroborated. I mean, and that's why it was necessary. Trump kind of made that necessary by calling her a liar. So this establishes what it was for. This is what they wanted to cover up. This is what they didn't want to come out during the 2016 election campaign. So I mean that's happened. A couple of other things have happened in the other cases. Fannie Lewis, she's the prosecutor in Georgia, who was being her involvement was being challenged in Hope Hicks was Mark Meadows' assistant, right? It was a challenge to because of her hiring of her lover, the appropriateness of her being involved in the prosecution in Georgia was challenged. The lower court upheld her right to be involved in the prosecution. That is now going to be heard in the appellate court in August, almost guaranteeing, unless the case is allowed to progress in the meantime, that case will not be held prior to the election. So we're getting narrowing down as to what can be heard before the election, because Judge Eileen Cannon, the Trump appointee on the classified documents case in Florida, has just opened up, not even set a deadline for some really strange motions that Trump's attorneys have made about some discovery issues down there, has made it almost certain that the trial won't even happen this year, let alone before the election. So it's really coming down to this case in New York and possibly the other Jack Smith case in Washington, D.C. We're not, but that's being delayed by the fact that the Supreme Court is trying to determine whether or not those cases can be heard because of whether or not Trump has blanket immunity, right? So that's what's going on in the Trump world. And today was a break from it. Stormy Daniels, I believe, comes back to. I'm sorry, did I say Fannie Willis? Who did I say?
Lewis, that's okay.
I said Lewis, Fannie Lewis. Okay. Fannie Willis. I also was tonight before I came here was listening to a hearing that Trump's attorneys and other defendants' attorneys are trying to get some of the cases, some of the causes of action dismissed in Georgia based on free speech, that you have the right to lie or be mistaken, on the basis that you have concerns about an election, even if you have ulterior motives of trying to get an election overturned. Very interesting arguments. Those hearings were done. Anyways, Dave, what do you got to say?
Thank you for that setup again. In this instance, we're talking about Trump's legal woes. I think I'll start at the trial that's like front and center with everybody, kind of in the news every day, and the one that like you described, Stormy Daniels' most recent salacious testimony. I think it's the what part of it, right? So it's like there's last week they started with, well, it was a catch and kill. And it was clearly a plan because the person who executed it through his newspaper, he said, this is our plan. And then they were like, well, when? It was like, well, it was right during the election. And then, well, was it really important during the election? Well, Hope Hicks, because the defense is basically saying, well, the reason that we didn't want this story, the reason, Donald Trump as an individual didn't want this story out was because of his marriage and his wife and his family and his reputation. But the prosecutors making the case that actually this was a political strategy, a political event, and therefore a political expenditure. So that's the case. Well, Hope Hicks actually did provide, even though she was, former press secretary, White House communications director, she also, took the stand and mentioned that she knew that Access Hollywood tape where Trump talked about groping women and getting away with it because he's rich and powerful, that was going to be a massive story for them. That was October, right before the election. And then she also said that Trump said, and again, it's hearsay, but she said that Trump said, wow, if this got out before the election, it would have been damaging to the process. So that there's that piece of it. And then she also said, well, the strategy, Michael Cohen's legal advice was for them to deny, which said, I never met this woman, didn't happen. It's just not real. So she's basically saying like, well, from inside the White House, this is how we managed the spin around the damaging reality of the alleged relationship. So I think that was pretty damning and pretty supportive of the prosecutor's case. And then, like you mentioned, and I alluded to when I first started speaking, Stormy Daniels' testimony is saying like, well, what's the what? Like, why did this money get spent? What actually happened? So this person's saying, hey, this happened. Why would I lie? But what she's also said is, hey, my publicist was shopping this thing around and I didn't get any bites. But as soon as that Access Hollywood tape was on TV, then I started getting lots of nibbles about getting purchased. And then there was further testimony about how, well, they were trying to play hardball with the price. And then so they were fearful that if they didn't close the deal before the election, that Stormy Daniels was saying, I'm just going to blow it up. I don't need the money bad enough. I'll just say something if you guys don't come up with the money before the election. So that I think that was the importance of her testimony, is like, this is how this went down. It was political. So I think that was important to the case. I'll let you say anything about that unless you want to move on to the next, to the Judge Cannon stuff.
I want to point out really quickly that, the Trump, I think, got annoyed. He's been, one of the things is he has not been happy that his attorneys in this trial have not been very aggressive. But they didn't make a whole lot of objections. They made some, but not a lot of objections during Stormy Daniels' testimony. The reason I think it was deliberate that they didn't, because if they'd made a lot of objections, it would have underscored the whole point. The prosecution could have gotten up and said, you saw all those objections they were making during her testimony? They didn't trust you with what she was saying. Do you think they trusted the voters with what she was saying? That's precisely why they wanted to shut her up. They were trying to shut her up during the trial, right? So, but Trump didn't understand that. What they will point out is that Trump was like, mouthing obscenities, and they can refer to that. Did you see his reaction during that? He wanted to shut her up then. He, of course, wanted to shut her up 8 years ago, right? So they're going to make use of all of that. So that was deliberate. They've probably explained it to him by now. He probably was screaming at him, why didn't you object more? And they probably explained it to him because they have brains, right? So it just, but the judge pointed that out to him, and that probably set that between them. Well, you didn't object that much. Well, of course we didn't, Your Honor. That was a strategic decision, but they can't say that,
Sure.
Anyway, I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah.
But we can move on to Cannon with the time.
So the documents case, I think, is interesting. There's a different prism to look at it through, but this is for folks that don't remember, because I know sometimes it gets a little lost in the wash. But Judge Cannon was somebody who had only, I think, 14 days of trial experience before Donald Trump appointed her as a judge. So she's a relatively inexperienced judge. And from the beginning, she's been accused of favoritism in terms of scheduling of this case, and also being willing to hear or consider arguments or motions that are seemingly desperate or remotely plausible. And so, for example, the special master that she assigned to review the documents at the beginning to see if they could be permissible in court or if national secrets would be revealed. So on a document by document basis, that's seen by critics as being favorable to Donald Trump in the sense that they could delay as much as possible. And then, that was eventually struck down by the appellate court as not necessary. And then also when they were actually scheduling, the prosecutor said, hey, let's start this thing December 2023. Donald Trump's team said, how about June? I think they proposed June 17th. And then so she picked a date in May. And so they were like leading up to that, like right now it's still May. So so leading up to that over the last 5 months, 4.5 months, the date actually did get pushed to that June 17th date that Donald Trump's attorneys had requested originally. So in part because of SIPA, I'd have to refresh my memory of what that stands for. Classified Information Procedures Act. So there were these SIPRA classified materials considerations, which basically that means that like, hey, if you're going to submit a document into evidence and testimony, it's got to be reviewed. So there's that piece of it that's even still part of the trial. So anyway, she's being seen as being not just favorable, but actually biased. And like you said, that who knows, like the jury's still out. That's to be, history will decide. But the reality is that Trump is getting an opportunity to have this case really come to fruition after the election, which in turn gives him a chance to potentially have it thrown out entirely once he wins the election, assuming he does.
All right. I point out that Trump's former staff attorney, Ty Cobb, slammed her hard. Said that it's a combination of bias and incompetence. Said the things that she has done here are inexplicable. All she's done today, though, is make official what everybody, including Jack Smith, already knew, which is that she had no intention of getting this case to trial, and she wasn't competent to get this case, to trial. There are a lot of people calling on the Fourth Circuit to remove her, and there's going to be pressure on her to do it today because it's just starting to look to people who are watching the case closely that she's just not even pretending anymore.
Right. Yeah. And just to put a fine point on that, I think there's like 5 different points that were raised by Trump's team. Again, like tenuously valid. And she's saying, hey, that's why there's no date on the calendar. It's an indefinite postponement because who knows, we're going to have to look at all these other issues. And I did see some legal scholars that said, well, actually, they're going to get very short hearings because they're open and shut. It's like legal bubble gum. It's not real. So there's limited validity. But because everyone is entitled to their day in court, obviously we need to reserve judgment. But the truth is that this case is the slowest of them all, probably for a reason, other than the fact that the Supreme, if you look at the Supreme Court, reviewing the Jack Smith case for immunity, that's obviously that's also quite a significant delay. Also, allegedly, some bias in that scheduling as well.
But the Supreme Court case shouldn't affect this one because the violations came after he was president. The minute he walked out with these documents, he was no longer president, although he's going to try to argue, he does argue that the immunity should last until he dies, but I don't think anybody's taking that one seriously. And but it's, one of the ironies here is that of all of the cases, this is the slam dunk one. This is the one where there's really nobody is seriously in legal world that's arguing that he really has a chance of defending this if it actually gets in front of a jury.
Yeah, and I know we're just down to the final seconds, but we'll see what happens in Georgia because that's going to be one that he can't dismiss if he does win the election. So I think there's a strong interest around the country to see that one actually gets off the ground.
Hey everyone, this is Marjorie Green. I'm excited to talk to you guys today. I want to go through the entire story of everything that's been going on. Have you guys been following 4chan, Q? It's a story that if you were actually to write this in a book, honestly, I probably would quit reading the book because it's so unbelievable. It's an anonymous person. Q is a patriot. We know that for sure. It's not just Democrat and Republican, left and right. You can dive down in that Civil War into deeper levels, where we have basically the deep state is fighting back against President Trump, the loyal people in his administration, and the American people, okay?
I mean, is it going to be true that the child pedophilia and the elites in the Washington, D.C., is that what we're really going to see come out? Is it true? Is the type of corruption we're going to see come out, is it going to be satanic worship?
So our third topic, I wasn't going to deal with it this week because I thought Marjorie Taylor Greene was backing down. There were all kinds of reports that she just saw the writing on the wall and was not going to try to remove Speaker Johnson. She and some of the other Freedom Caucus people were unhappy with the fact that he was pushing through bipartisan deals on Ukraine aid and even aid to Israel, and not pushing through whatever it is she thinks that is right for the border. And she's been threatening this and saying his days were numbered. Well, late today, she pushed her motion and she got slapped down, but hard. Her motion got booed as she was introducing it. She ended up with 43 votes, all but a dozen of them by Democrats. We'll talk about that in a minute. We'll get into who voted for her and who voted against her. This happened literally, I think, about an hour or two before the show began. There's a lot to talk about, but I'm wondering if this is kind of, I think she spent all of her political capital on this. We don't have a whole lot to say on the final moments. We're still kind of catching up on it ourselves, but we can talk about what's been happening over the past few weeks. They had a meeting, which both of them said there wasn't any real negotiating going. They were just talking. I think 2 meetings possibly, but maybe I don't know. Is this an indication that the Freedom Caucus people, Matt Gaetz did not vote with her? Other people in that group didn't vote for her. Kosar did vote with her, and a couple other names I recognize, but mostly a bunch of Democrats voted for her, kind of in the left. Ocasio-Cortez, Tlaib, and other people who just couldn't bring themselves to vote to save Johnson, just because he's at least used to be far right. And also maybe just because I think they enjoyed pushing this, and so they actually voted to advance it. I think like probably about 30 of them. I haven't really counted them, but Dave, is this? I don't want to say that this is going to usher in bipartisan politics. I really doubt it, but it may take the edge off of the extreme partisanship by disempowering at least a few of the extremists, at least for the time being. I don't know. What does this mean, Dave?
So I think if we take a half step back, that the complaints from the Freedom Caucus, some of the Freedom Caucus members, were actually around existent bipartisanship. So the bipartisanship that we're alluding to here is something that actually already happened, and this is the response to that. So advancing the budget to keep the government from shutting down was perceived by some of these folks, some of these 10 Republicans who voted to vacate the speaker, that was an offense to their principles, or if not their principles, certainly their political position. But so, like you said, it's also that aid to Ukraine, and also there was a third issue I think that they pointed out that was particularly important to them. I even said it, I think. The surveillance power. So there was the renewal of the ability for, and in fact, there was an enhancement in the ability for warrantless wiretapping of Americans who are in communication with international people, and that it's a cause célèbre for some privacy folks on both the right and the left. So to a certain extent, you could see, yes, politics makes strange bedfellows. There's some small degree of bipartisanship, for example, in that surveillance issue. But I think in reality, what we're talking about here is because that number was only 10, right? Because there was only 10 Republicans who stuck together. Even 2 of them they said, well, in reality, I just couldn't stomach voting in a bipartisan way to save our own speaker, who I actually like and don't even want to vacate. So it was just some weird kind of like, well, solidarity with the extreme colleagues of theirs that just didn't want to be part of the bipartisanship. So I think it's a little bit more polarized than it would appear on the surface. But sort of big picture, what does this mean? What does this entail? I think it's worth mentioning, like you said, Gates did not vote for this. And so I saw elsewhere that Donald Trump did support Speaker Johnson's tenure, because in his opinion, this makes the Republican Party look bad when you've got people like Marjorie Taylor Greene trying to undermine another speaker. Like Kevin McCarthy was taken out like circular firing squad style because of there was a purity test. And so is the purity test so severe that they're actually going to lash out because they, on a single policy or two, or does it make more sense for them to try to keep things together, at least through the election, to make Donald Trump look a little bit better and not present a liability? He's got lots of liabilities on his own. He doesn't need Congress. So maybe that's what this is a calculus for some of these, because don't forget the Republicans are the majority, but they could only muster 10 votes, or it was really, they got 33 Republicans. They got 33 Democrats rather on board too. And those were people that just felt good apparently about voting to vacate. So it was a little bit of just scratching the itch and less about any issue, like highbrow issue.
Well, it's kind of funny that those two didn't want to vote. They voted for it just because they didn't want to vote in a bipartisan manner, and then they ended up voting with 33 Democrats.
Yeah, I know.
It was more imbalanced there. So I mean, that's and not only that, with the radical Democrats, I mean, that looks like about a third of the progressive caucus that voted against him there. I mean, it's just Ocasio-Cortez, Cory Bush, John Garamendi. I mean, this is the list goes on. Rashida Tlaib, anyway, Joaquin Castro. I mean, these are not people that they would want to be associated with. So it's funny, but I think that what it is they just want to cover their bases both ways. They want to keep their relationships going on in Congress, but be able to wink and nod to MAGA, who knows where they're going to go. The people, well, Trump said it's okay, so it's okay, but again, to vote along with the Democrats, MAGA is probably very confused tonight. Any of them are paying attention. Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering how they're going to react to this. Maybe they just don't understand it and won't pay attention. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Part of what Marjorie Taylor Greene's defense, I guess you could call it, in the past few weeks has been she was kind of saying, look, America's in a bad, this is her words, of course, America's in a bad place. Just ask the people in your community, with Congress members, when you go home, talk to the people, and they'll tell you, how frustrated and negative they are about everything, and that includes their own speaker. So that was her position, and it's not a particularly wide spread position in the party. So maybe I've talked to some conservatives and some Republicans about her, and I think of course, the traditional like Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney types, they're not buying what she says, but a lot of the other folks that are just sort of traditional habitual Republicans, they'll just kind of defend her and say, hey, she's speaking her piece, she's standing up to power, she wants to empower. If the speaker really is gonna do the bipartisan thing, then we need to at least stand up to him, even if it's not going to be remove him.
Yeah. I mean, ordinarily you'd say, well, she's burned her bridges. She's not going to be able to accomplish any legislation, but I'm not aware that she's accomplished any legislation anyway. Right. I mean, I'm not, is her signature on any significant legislation at all? I haven't heard of any. So, I remember somebody in there, as McCarthy said, she is a serious legislature. When you have to say that, when you actually have to make that statement public, she's not. So anyway, I just, But where does it go? I mean, that's not even like, how many people are in the Freedom Caucus at this point? About 40?
So interestingly, my recollection is that the Republican leadership group, whatever that is technically called, they don't formally have a membership list, which I thought was really interesting. These are the folks that are like behind, for example, like a balanced budget, which oh my God, it sounds so, even saying it out loud just sounds ridiculous almost, because our deficit is so massive. But the truth is that there are people who are saying we need to draw the line on spending somewhere, somehow. It's an existential threat to our children and our grandchildren. That group of people, they don't actually publicly have a membership list. But in terms of the caucus itself, I suspect that it's relatively, probably about half of the Republicans is my guess. It's not as big as the Progressive Caucus, but I'd have to double check it. But the truth is that is a principle that Republican leadership and just the grassroots, even they do try to apply like microeconomic home issues, the kitchen table issues, to how to run a country and how to run a superpower of a country that is, like right now, what's our budget, like almost $2 trillion or something. It just doesn't make sense to so, it's a bigger issue to talk about. But that Freedom Caucus, I think they stick together basically because it's an anti-establishment, anti-Leviathan. Like the government is just too big, too powerful, too engaged, too expensive, and we just need to, what did they say? Grover Norquist and the tax group, Starve the Beast.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you can mention too here if you want the 41 seats. There you go. Wikipedia. I was guessing about a third. So a little more than a third, 40% ish. Right. Oh no, there's 218. So yeah. So it's about 20% of their caucus. That's not too far off. Citation needed. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll see what Wiki says. Thanks to our producer. But yeah, so I was going to mention that Plan 2025, where they're talking about replacing civil servants and changing the dynamic within every part of the federal government. It's in that theme. It's in that lane that people like the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world really have refuge, because they like having people like her in their midst.
Well, let me ask you this question. If you're a right winger, has Johnson sold out?
Interesting. So I think there's the short answer, yes, he did. Because he's in the hot seat. And that's what you do. When you're Speaker of the House, you got to look at the national issues. But he's inoculated from that because he is such an extreme right winger in every sense of the word, his entirety of his history, and nobody, I think, would question it because of his track record and history.
Yeah, I mean, they do say it doesn't happen with everybody. When a extremist comes to power, events forces you to moderate. Everybody expected that with Trump. And he actually started to do it at one point. There was one moment where they had him in the room for immigration reform, but then the hardliners behind him got to him before that meeting, and then all of a sudden it all shut down. Things that he'd been willing to talk about, no, that was it. It was just like, why? And the Democrats got there. It was like, then why'd you waste our time? Because he wanted to do it. But he was not. What they learned was he really wasn't his own boss. There was a coalition behind him, and they were insisting on that. But so he with the coalition that was behind him, he did not moderate, not one bit at all. But that's an exception to the rule. And Republicans, the weirdest thing is that usually throughout history in American politics anyway, you would appeal to your left or your right while running for the nomination. And then once you won the nomination, you would appeal towards the center. But Republicans haven't done that in like the last 5 elections. I mean, even McCain didn't do that. He played to the right. He even appointed chose one of their right-wing people for his VP candidate. He didn't vet her very well, but he chose that, and then he just played to the right. Same with Romney. Pretended to be much more right-wing than he was. Attacked his own health care policy, for crying out loud. So but Johnson got into office and he did what he had to do. So whatever his ideology, he seems to be a mutant of a Republican right now, a throwback to some DNA of the past where he actually wants to govern. He actually knows that he's got Republicans that are in, swing districts that have to actually run for re-election where the voters don't think like they do in his district or Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. So very interesting.
I think the immigration issue is a good example of how Johnson was able to thread the needle, because even though Republicans did come to terms with that foreign policy package that included the strictest immigration restrictions ever continents at any point in recent memory, modern history, Donald Trump said no. It's an imperative issue for this and other Republican election folks probably got together and said we can't pass reform even if it's exactly what we want, because we can't give them a win. So that was the one thing that Johnson made clear: we're not passing that bill. But they passed all the foreign policy pieces, save for that immigration. So that immigration reform, and they won't have another opportunity to pass reform like that as long as there's a Democratic president, especially now that they got their other priorities met. So I just think again, it's actually pretty savvy. It probably goes against his values, but he's I'm surprised I'm saying this, but he exhibited a degree of bipartisanship that is genuine leadership.
The funny thing is even if they take both the House and Senate, because of the filibuster, they may never get a bill like that again, period.
Right.
Eeny, meeny, chili beanie, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
This brings us to predictions. What do you have for us, Dave?
So this week I saw that Politico recently reported that less than 20% of the $1.6 trillion in green energy and infrastructure stimulus funds that were actually spent. So that includes nearly like 500 billion of tax incentives that are sitting on the table, not yet allocated. Rough math, that's about 125 billion only has been spent, which means that the president has a golden opportunity to really, make immense commitments and broadcast them publicly. He can make this the cornerstone of his reelection campaign if he just targeted these loans, grants, and tax credits in a way that people were receptive to. And I think it would take persuasive leadership, which we haven't seen yet, but he really could make the case now. One could make the case, rather, that he could cement his legacy. He really has an opportunity to do so before it's too late. So my prediction is that I'm not the only one. Politico made it through with this information, and that the president's White House strategists know this too. So I think we should expect to see a wave of investment announcements beginning in the coming months and lasting through all the way up to November.
It'd be nice if he opened it up to buying cars that are hybrids and also used recycled electric cars, but we'll see. All right, I'm going to make a prediction. Maybe this is wishful thinking on my part, but looking at the events in the Middle East and with the protests and with the realities that Biden is facing, I believe that privately he is having Blinken put the screws to Netanyahu, and Netanyahu's feeling the pressure. One thing we didn't talk about was a demonstration in Tel Aviv of 10,000 Israelis who protested, a very intense protest last Saturday. He is feeling the pressure. I'm wondering if there are opposition parties who are offering Netanyahu a similar deal that Johnson was offered by the Democrats here, because there does seem to be some kind of movement in the ceasefire talks, and both sides are talking tough about no more compromises and the like. But I'm predicting that there may be a breakthrough in the ceasefire talks coming, and that there will be at least a long-term ceasefire that comes within the next couple weeks before the end of May, and which may put an end to the protests, and that Biden moves on into the next chapter of his race. I'm hoping so. Maybe it's all just wishful thinking on my part, but we'll find out. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.